Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I am Eric Yanis, filling in for Eric Yanis, and this is another episode of the Eric Yanis Show, episode 50. Now, some of you may be wondering, particularly if you are an audio-only listener of my show, why this is not episode 49, and that would be because you missed episode 49 because it was only on YouTube last week. And the reason for that is quite simple. I could not extract an audio file. There was a technical issue with the file, and it was impossible for me to basically extract just the audio. So if you missed last week's episode, that is because you are not subscribed to my YouTube channel, where you can find not only the audio that you're listening to, but also the video. So this is, in fact, episode 50. And in today's show, I'm going to do a debate analysis between the recently released debate on the Lex Friedman Podcast between Ben Shapiro, the co-founder of the Daily Wire, and Destiny, a very popular liberal YouTuber and streamer. And as I mentioned, they go on to the Lex Friedman Podcast. If you're not familiar with the Lex Friedman Podcast, very, very popular podcast. Lex Friedman was a computer scientist who initially started his show for computer science, and it grew so popular, he eventually turned it into a podcast where he just invites basically the leading thinkers all around the world in philosophy, science, religion, and politics. And oftentimes sort of one-off, long-form debates. And in this case, and not too infrequently, but in this case, he brought in Destiny, Ben Shapiro, to debate ostensibly conservatism versus liberalism in at least their modern American instantiations. So I'm not going to go through the whole debate because that would be another very, very long episode, and it's just not necessary. But I am going to address several of the key points that they get into. I want to talk in particular about their discussion of education and give, I think that'll give us some flavor of how the debate went, and then I'm going to just offer my thoughts generally on the rest of the debate. Before I share with you any particular clips of the episode and the debate between Ben and Destiny, I want to just set this conversation up. I want to give us some context here. Number one would be, I don't think that this should have been titled a debate, and I think frequently conversations like this, which are essentially just discussions or disagreements between two people, are labeled as debates on YouTube in particular, when really this wasn't a debate at all. A debate, I'm a bit of a stickler when it comes to debate. I think debates are great things, and I also think they're definable things, and I don't think this was a debate. I think this was a discussion between Destiny and Ben, which encompassed a large number of questions. So it really wasn't a debate. I know that that's kind of like splitting hairs, but I think it's really important because debates, in my mind, are over very specific questions, and they're formal. You know, they have opening statements, uninterrupted opening statements, structured rebuttals and counter rebuttals, and then, you know, oftentimes they'll feature a cross-examination period, and I think those are really important formats for fleshing out ideas. This quote-unquote debate between Ben Shapiro and Destiny did not do any of that. And I think it shows. I think the lack of structure and the lack of format in a debate like this often muddies the water, let's say, in a discussion between them, and it's hard to track the logic of each speaker as carefully as you could in a formal debate. Nothing wrong with the format they took. It's just wasn't really a debate, and I hope people can see that, and I hope they'll see this more as an informal discussion between two people who agree and disagree on all kinds of different topics. So that's point number one. Point number two, before I get into it, let me just, by way of introduction, if you're unfamiliar, particularly I think with Destiny, I think a lot of the people in my audience are going to be more familiar with Ben Shapiro. He's rather well known. Destiny is like what I think he would self-identify as a traditional liberal. I don't know if he would use that label or not. He certainly distinguishes himself from the progressives or what he might call the radical left. I think he sees himself more as a traditional liberal. It's not clear to me what he often means by that term, in the sense of like classical liberalism would be very synonymous with conservatism in the American tradition today. Although, again, in conservatism, and this is the challenge with these kinds of labels, even conservatism, as anybody who's been following my writing and podcast for a while knows, is a difficult thing to nail down. The sort of mainstream versions of conservatism that are often expressed in American politics today look very different from conservatism, classical conservatism of the same era that classical liberalism was alive. And I'm, to be quite fair, not sure exactly where Ben Shapiro would align himself. In many years past, he often used the label, I believe, of classical liberal. Today, he seems to be much more comfortable with the notion of like a classical traditional conservatism of the Burkean type, the tradition, the modern tradition, which began with Edmund Burke in England. So just by way of that introduction, I just want to give people some sense of who Destiny is. He's not defending progressivism here. He makes that very clear throughout the debate. And I personally find Destiny to be a very smart guy. I think I think his sun is rising. Let's put it that way. I think something that flows throughout the debate, and maybe we'll get into this later, and hopefully you'll see this, is I think a lot of people go up to debate Destiny. He's done a lot of debates prior to this one online on a number of issues. I think probably his most well-known debate in the recent past was his debate with the Catholic apologist Trent Horn on the issue of abortion, which was on the At Whatever podcast or the Whatever podcast. And that was a very interesting debate as well. And I found some similarities between that debate with Trent Horn and the debate which we'll cover today with Ben Shapiro, in that I think both Trent and Ben were a little unprepared for the kind of arguments and the kind of method of reasoning that Destiny employs for his positions. And I think there's just something to be said for people like Trent and Ben, who are both very similar, I think, in their style of debate. These guys, Ben is obviously a very experienced debater. If you don't know Trent Horn, he's also a very experienced debater. And they often debate people from an increasingly bygone era, not people that hold Destiny's position, but more radical liberal types. And it would be unfair to characterize Destiny as that kind of individual. And so I think Ben in this debate and Trent in the prior debate, and lots of people who tend to debate Destiny, get caught off guard by his more nuanced positions, and they end up trying to debate straw men. And I think in that way, they undercut the success of their position, because Destiny often, I think, appears to go away the victor, at least in some cases, because the real heart of his argument is never being addressed by his opponent. And he can get his opponents to kind of get caught or end up conceding what he originally argued. And I think we see that in this debate. So, in my opinion, I don't think that this debate went well for Ben Shapiro. I know a lot of people really like Ben. I've got nothing against him personally. I don't really watch any of his content or consume any of his content. But I've certainly seen a lot of his debates back in the day, growing up, and always thought he was an excellent debater, especially in a formal debate. So I don't think Ben probably even viewed this as a formal debate. He certainly didn't come prepared with evidence towards a specific proposition, which would be expected if this was a real debate. But I don't know how he felt coming out of this debate, but having watched it myself, I think Destiny came away much stronger, at least probably seeming a lot stronger to any onlookers in the debate. I don't think Ben won this. And they addressed a number of different questions, ranging from education through foreign policy and which president is going to be the best, and They debate Russia-Ukraine and the Israel and Palestine conflict and etc. And I think over and over again, Destiny, on the whole, seemed to come away a lot stronger. And I just want to focus my analysis on where I think particularly Ben got it right in some senses, but got it very wrong in other senses. And I wish the debate had taken a different turn and a different character, because I think there was an opportunity for that. So without any further ado, we're going to take a look at just a couple of the moments, sort of, I think, critical moments from the debate. If you want to watch the entire debate, I'll throw the link at the bottom of the video to the Lex Friedman Podcast, where you can watch the whole debate. It was a fascinating conversation, and I think it was a good one. It actually was a very enjoyable, non-hostile conversation to watch. But I think it made some critical errors. So let's start with the first question, which Destiny opened up the debate with, which was about education. And I want us to take particular notice of the specific claim, or rather, the specific claim at the heart of Destiny's question. And then I'll sort of highlight that for you. And then we'll look at Ben's answer and where I think his response gets it in part correct, but I think he misses the heart of Destiny's question critically, which kind of undercuts Ben's whole position later on. So let's just watch a quick clip of Destiny's original question.
Before I ask this question, it's going to relate to education. We can agree, broadly speaking, that statistics are real and that not everybody could do everything. So for a grounded example, my life was pretty bad. I got into streaming and I turned my life around, and that was really cool, but I can't expect everybody to do what I did, right? Like everybody being able to join the NBA or to be like a streamer.
Well, of course, everybody has different qualities, sure.
Okay. So I used to be a lot more libertarian when I was 2021. And one of the things that dramatically changed kind of my view on government manipulation of things in in society came when it came time to deal with my son and the school that he went to. And one of the things that I noticed was when it came time to send my son to school, I could either do private education or I could do public. Personally, I did 12 years of Catholic private education. However, the public schools in Nebraska, depending on where you lived, were very, very, very good. And I opted for a certain district. I bought a house there. I moved there. And then my son was able to go to those schools. And he's been going through those schools. And the difference of availability of like technology, like these kids are taking home iPads in like first grade. They've got like huge computer labs and everything. Do you think that there is some type of, I don't want to say injustice or unfairness, because I'm not even looking at it that way, just pragmatically, that there might be children that are in certain schools that if they just had better funding or more access to technologies or things available to them, that those kids would become more productive members of society, that with like a little bit of a help, they could actually achieve more and do better for all of society?
Okay, so here let's address just the first question that Destiny asks. Destiny is highlighting a common area of disagreement between conservatives and liberals, and he frames his question in the context of his own personal intellectual development, namely his move from libertarianism to a more traditionally liberal position. And I think the reason that he's doing that is to offer us a context for the specific heart of the issue that he's getting at, which is government's role in shifting the balance for disadvantages in societies. In other words, he's making an argument that government ought to have a role in interfering in the market, right? Something that a libertarian would disagree with, hence his contrasting with his earlier libertarian belief. And he's making this argument on the basis that in his own experience, as well as he'll make an argument from a little bit of research later on, that there is a difference that simple external factors make in the life of a child, and we all benefit from it. Now, he didn't exactly make that highly structured argument, but I think that that's probably the fairest characterization, at least that I can see, of the position that he's representing, which is to say that the government has a just role in providing resources to education because those resources do, in fact, improve education. Now, implicit in there is the claim that improving education is something we all benefit from, right? Public education is something that is a public good. We want more educated, more literate, more technologically advanced people, more morally disciplined people, somebody might even add. We want more of those people coming out of the American education system. And Destiny is saying, look, since external factors like funding, later on you'll see him use air conditioning and food as sort of two key factors in a child's ability to learn. These kinds of external factors, and I'm using that phrase specifically, they do have an impact on kids' ability to learn. So, and this is very critical, everything else held equal, shouldn't there be a role for the government to improve those kinds of external factors, to mitigate naturally occurring disadvantages? And he even says it's not so much a moral injustice thing as it is just a practical concern. Can't we just sort of look at it consequentially and say, like, if the government can provide $1 million, all other things being equal, to local schools and education, which help improve education, which helps to improve society, then isn't that a good thing? What's objectionable about that? Before we get on to Ben's response, and I'm going to respond in my own way after we hear Ben's response, I just want us to focus very briefly that the claim here is, or really, let me start with the question. The question is, if children had more access to things like technology or air conditioning or food, wouldn't they achieve more? That was the question that he asked right at the end of that clip to Ben. Wouldn't you agree that if kids had better access to technology and other kinds of resources, whatever they may be, that show to have a positive impact on education, wouldn't they achieve more? And then again, I think the implicit claim is, or the implicit question, the follow-up question would be, and if in their achieving more, wouldn't that be better for all of us, right? Before I show you Ben's response, I just want to point out what should have been obvious to somebody like Ben, and he never addresses it. Even if, and this question is susceptible to what I call the even if objection, or what is sometimes called the even if objection. Even if we say yes to Destiny's question, even if Ben were to say absolutely, all things being equal, if kids had more access to technology, would they achieve more? Yes. Even if that doesn't establish any particular political position. Destiny is here trying to represent the liberal position, which is namely that government should fill that role. That government is not only a provider of possible extra resources for school, but the best provider of those kinds of resources to school. Hopefully that makes sense. But in other words, even if we concede, yes, greater technology, greater funding, greater food, air conditioning would all be great things that help people to learn, it still remains to be shown that the government's role is one in which doing that. The government's role is one where they are supposed to do that is the government's job to provide those resources. Destiny hasn't offered us any reason yet to assume that the government is even able to do that, let alone that given competition between government and other sorts of private institutions, that it's the best alternative. So I'm going to circle back to that in a second. But before we do that, let's just hear what Ben's response was to Destiny's question. And in part, he gets it right, I think, by disagreeing with the premise of the question. Unfortunately, it's not very clear what he objects to in the question, other than that he thinks there are greater issues in education. So you'll see that in a second. Let's just go and look at Ben's response.
That on the list of priorities, when it comes to education, the availability of technology is actually fairly low on the list of priorities.
Sure. The two things I've heard are food availability and I think air conditioning, I think, are the two biggest ones that I hear. But sure.
Well, I mean, the biggest thing in terms of education itself, not just the physical facilities that we're talking about, would actually be two-parent family households.
Sure.
Communities that have fathers in them is actually the number one decisive, according to Roland Fryer and many studies done on this particular topic. And the idea that money alone, that investment of resources is the top priority in schooling is belied by the fact that LAUSD, which is where I went to school when I was younger, they pour an enormous amount of money into LAUSD. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars very often per student, and it does not result in better schooling outcomes. And so when you say, if we could give every kid an iPad, would you give every kid an iPad? The question is not, if I had a replicator machine from Star Trek, would I give everybody an enormous amount of stuff? Sure, I would. Every resource is finite. Every resource is limited, and you have to prioritize what are the outcomes that you seek in terms of the means with which you are seeking them. And so, again, I think that the question is I quibble with the premise of the question, which is that, again, the chief injustice when it comes to education on the list of injustices is lack of availability to technology, or that it's a funding problem. I just don't think that's the case.
Sure.
I think the fairest way we could characterize Ben's response to Destiny is to offer a version of the even if objection that I just gave you, which is that Ben basically, and it's a lot harder, I think, throughout this debate to track the logic of what Ben's saying. He tends to really repeat himself and go off on long tangents, and I think that even of itself was kind of a point missed, or a point rather for Destiny. Because Destiny, I think, did a much better job being concise and specific with his language, whereas Ben kind of pontificated a lot. So I'm going to skip a lot of what he said there in the middle, but focus really on what he said at the end there, which was a version of the even if objection. What he said to Destiny was, I could agree that all things being equal, technology, every kid having an iPad be great, right? But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. So that's kind of a version of the objection, which is to say that we live in a finite world with finite resources, and not all things are equal. So the focus, or our top priority, should not be just pouring money into it, which is a characterization of the liberal position. I think the liberal position, which Ben is very familiar with, but it's not the argument that Destiny is really offering here, and it also doesn't really address all things being equal, because the whole point of an all things being equal argument is to say that that Destiny can agree with Ben, and in a moment we're going to hear him actually agree with Ben. Yes, two-parent households, they can both agree. We can all agree, according to Destiny, that two-parent households is going to be the greatest determinative factor in a child's success, not just in education, but broadly speaking in life. However, and this is critical to Destiny's position, something that Ben missed initially, which is that that's fine, but there may not be any kind of educational reform that we could make at a policy level which would produce more two-parent households. Now, Ben might have reasonably disagreed with that claim. Destiny makes it a little further on. But the point is that Destiny is saying, granted, two-parent households are perhaps the most determinative factor in a child's educational success. However, there's virtually nothing we can do in educational reform at a policy level to change that. But all things being equal, there's still an argument that we should help out, that government should be involved in providing resources to schools. And simply pointing back to a bigger determinative issue like two-parent households doesn't address the heart of Destiny's claim, which is that even if that's true, and even if we had all the two-parent households in the world, we could still say that the government should have a role in balancing the scales at a public educational level. I think that is the heart of Destiny's argument. It has nothing to do with two-parent households. He can agree. Similarly, he can offer Ben an even if objection. Even if we had only two-parent households in the United States, there would still be inequities in school, and there would still be a practical role for the government to play in balancing those inequities out by providing resources to schools. And you'll see in a second in this next clip, he makes that more clear by even offering sort of, can we just agree on a baseline that basically, even if every school isn't exactly equitable, exactly equal in their resources, there should be a baseline established by policy. Schools should not have leaky gyms and so on. That's the heart of his argument, and I think Ben missed that. And in my opinion, the better response here would have been to recognize what Destiny was saying from the get-go and simply turn the question back on him with the even if objection that I offered earlier, which is to say, even if I said yes, technology, resources, air conditioning, food are all things that make learning more possible in schools. Even if I conceded that, that doesn't concede the liberal position. You'd have to say why it is that the government is the best entity for performing that role. And I think that objection will become even more clear or even more relevant in this next clip. And then at the end of it, I'll say something more about what is the classically conservative position on this issue, which Ben eventually does get to. But before that, let's jump back in to hear Destiny's clarification of his position, and I think he does a great job, and then Ben's second response.
But then I feel like this is kind of the conservative merry-go-round where it's like, what can we do to help with schools? So two of the things that I've seen, I think, that are usually brought up in research is one is air conditioning, that children in hotter environments just don't learn as well. And then the second one is access to food. So like kids that are given like a breakfast or a lunch that's provided at school, like increases educational outcomes. Now, I agree that neither of these things might be determinative in like, 20% of kids were graduating and now 80% of kids are graduating, or these kids are all going, from with their GEDs into the workforce and now these kids are all suddenly becoming engineers. But in terms of where we can help, do you think there should be like some minimum threshold or minimum baseline of like, at the very least, every school should have a non-leaky gym, or every school should have, if children can't afford lunch or breakfast, like some sort of food provided, or every school should have these like baseline things?
So again, I'm going to quibble with the premise of the question, because I think that when it comes to, for example, food insecurity, school food programs, again, you can always pour money into any program and at the margins create change. I mean, there's no doubt that pouring money onto anything will create change in a marginal way. The question is, how large is the margin and how big is the movement? Right. So the delta is what I'm looking at. And so I think that you're starting at a second order question, which is, what if we ignore what I would think are the big primary questions of education, namely family structure, value of education at home, how much you have parents who are capable or willing to help with homework, what are the incentive structures we can set up for a society that actually facilitate that, how local communities take ownership of their schools is a big one.
Okay, so here we see I think, very great clarification of his position from Destiny on why Ben's counter-argument doesn't really apply. He concedes that two-parent households are probably going to be the highest determinative factor. I want to just identify what he means by the conservative merry-go-round. I don't want to show you the entire debate. I don't want to spend too long just grinding through this one issue, but he basically defines the conservative merry-go-round. I think it's gaslighting. It's essentially gaslighting. I don't know why he calls it the conservative merry-go-round instead of just saying, I want to avoid the issue of gaslighting. If you're not familiar with what gaslighting is, it's a informal fallacy in argumentation where you're constantly, it's also called moving the goalposts, right? If you started out the conversation saying, how could we improve education? And then liberals in Destiny's mind will say, well, we could offer greater technology and greater access to food. Conservatives in Destiny's mind will respond, oh, but that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is two-parent households. Destiny would view this as a way of moving the goalposts. In other words, we could agree that if the world had only two-parent households, the world would look a lot better. Destiny concedes that. What Destiny is claiming is that there's really nothing that the government can do to change that, so that's not really germane to the debate that they're having. And I think in the context of this debate, he's largely correct. Again, I think Ben might have just denied what Destiny was saying, and later on in the debate, to a certain extent, he does do that. He pushes back on the notion that there's nothing we can do to increase the likelihood of two-parent households, or there's nothing at the policy level that either increases or decreases the likelihood of two-parent households, because, of course, there are things that we can do. And these policy decisions don't just exist in a vacuum, right? Welfare policies have an effect on two-parent households, which then have an effect on education quality. So a conservative is going to prioritize, before we continue to spend more money on education, let's perhaps roll back some welfare reforms that seem to have a consequence of eliminating two-person households or making them extremely less likely. Now, Destiny's not going to agree perhaps with that. I don't think he agrees with that interpretation of history, but that's where Ben could have pushed back and said, no, there's reasonable debate to be had. If you really want to talk about education, we ought to start talking about welfare policy, because that's going to be an enormous focus of the conservative position. And welfare policy does bleed into everything. And if welfare policy does have an effect on the likelihood of two-parent households, and we are already agreeing that that's going to be the largest determinative impact on something like education, well, then that's where the focus of our education debate should be. So I think Ben does do a good job on that later on. But in this particular clip, again, I think he just misses the point. He is not addressing the heart of Destiny's argument, which is that even if we had all the two-parent households in the world, couldn't we still agree on a baseline? And I think eventually Ben does understand that, because towards the end of their section on education, he basically concedes the point to Destiny. That's very critical, because I want to point out that it's perfectly consistent with the conservative position, especially at the local level, that governments do have a role in education, that in our local communities, we can band together, pool resources, and give those resources to schools in order to give cheaper access, more public access to schools. That is consistent with conservatism. For people who are not aware of that, I'd just like to recommend a book for you. Here is a book on the intellectual history of the conservative movement. It's called The Conservative Mind, and it's written by Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk is probably the most prominent conservative public intellectual of the 20th century in America. And he wrote this book to trace the ideas from Burke through Eliot and so on. And the conservative position is not synonymous and not identical with the libertarian position. Many conservatives have argued for a role of the government in supporting the community, particularly at the local level. Conservatives historically have had a much harder time. They've had a much harder time accepting that at a national level. Rather, government should be as local as possible. That national government has no role in education, whereas state and local government you might have a better position. And you have some disagreement there, right? Conservative could still argue, while being in the classically conservative position, that it's still not going to be, even if it's not objectionable that government be involved in schooling at a local level, there may still just be a practical argument against that, namely that government is not the best entity to allocate resources like food, technology, and air conditioning to public education systems. And Destiny does nothing in this conversation to establish that government is the best entity to do that. He simply assumes that if we agreed on the question, which he turns back into a moral question at the end of that last clip, where he says, ought we not to provide schools with these kinds of resources? Shouldn't schools not have leaky gyms? Shouldn't they have access to? These are all normative questions. Again, even if we agreed on all of that, all moral questions. So we can all agree it would be great if we lived in a world where no school had a leaky gym. The question remains, why should that be government's job? Why not simply rely on personal charity, the church, social institutions, and private local communities banding together to provide those kinds of resources to school? There is a world of literature out there showing that those kinds of institutions do a much better job at providing quality resources to their communities than the national government. So Destiny never addresses that, even anywhere in the debate. And I think, unfortunately, it's largely because Ben never addresses that. Ben never gets to the heart of Destiny's objection. And instead, towards the end of the conversation on education, actually concedes Destiny's position, which is the classically conservative position, namely at the local level, he has no problem with government providing resources to schools, which just sounds like he's conceding what Destiny argued for all along. And I think without that that piece in the middle about really understanding Destiny's argument, I assume this will just look to most onlookers of the debate like Ben flip-flopped on this issue, that he got caught with his foot in his mouth and ended up conceding the education question to Destiny. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to cover two more points, two more key moments in this debate. The first one is going to be the interaction that happens between Destiny and Ben on the question of just Trump v. Biden in a general political matchup, and with the economy as a specific focus of that conversation and the claims that Destiny makes in the economy. And the second key moment that we're going to address, which I think is a massive missed opportunity for Ben, was on the question of foreign policy, which bled into a much longer conversation about Russia and Ukraine and Israel, Palestine, etc. But the two key moments I'm going to focus on just have to do with the interaction of Trump v. Biden. So first off, we're going to take a look at the conversation they have on the question of who should be or who was the better president, Trump or Biden, in their first term. And I think implicit in here was the notion of, why should listeners support one or the other? The first thing I want to say about this is that I don't think Ben said almost anything substantive here that's really worth discussing. I mean, it's all the sort of normal talking points, not per se anything really bad in it. It's just he made general statements about Trump was better on foreign policy. Trump was obviously better on the economy. Trump's rhetoric is obviously bad. Ben doesn't personally support it, but obviously on the basis of policies like foreign policy and economics, he will be supporting Trump, and Trump was a lot better than Biden in his first term. That's really it. I'm not even going to show you Ben's response to the question because I thought it was just so general in nature. Destiny, again, I think here seemed to come out a lot stronger with very pointed objections, or at least rhetorical questions towards that kind of position. He made, a fairly good brief case that Trump was a far more divisive president than Biden, something I think he knew that Ben would agree with him on. And I think a lot of people would agree with him on. He cited several examples of people, even in Trump's prior administration, not agreeing to even work with Trump, who now hate Trump, who have come out publicly against Trump in huge ways. Trump, in other words, AKA, is a very controversial figure. And implicit in that argument that he gives is the idea that a more unifying president like Joe Biden would be better. Okay, now we're gonna just skip over that for now. I want to get to the main, just this brief moment that happens between Destiny and Ben on the issue of the economy in their respective presidencies, and just check out what Destiny says about some of his comments on Biden and Trump.
In terms of the economy, I do think it's funny that Republicans are very keen to say that, like, well, we can't really grade Trump, post-COVID, because obviously COVID messed everything up, which is fair. But pre-COVID, what did Trump do? Yeah, he did deficit spending, tax cuts. He presided over historic low interest rates and an economy that was already like blazing past the final years of Obama. We were posting all-time highs on all the stock markets in 2013 onwards. Unemployment rates were falling. Now under Biden, unemployment rates are even lower than they were under Trump. But it sucks that for Trump, we can say, well, we can't really hold him accountable for 2020. That was COVID. Well, all we have for Biden is post-COVID. We don't have any pre-COVID Biden, economy. And it was the same thing for Obama too, coming in right after the housing collapse as well. And it sucks that Republicans are able to walk out of office, having burned the entire American society to the ground economically. And now we've got to try to evaluate, okay, well, what did Obama do during his first 2 to 3 to 4 years, just trying to recover from where the housing crash left it? And then we look at Biden now, who's trying to recover from COVID. And now we're grading him on a totally different scale than what Trump is being graded on.
So here we see that Destiny's claim is more or less that we should believe that Joe Biden and similarly Obama's economy are better than Trump's. He makes this reference to a kind of defense that he says Republicans are keen to offer in defense of Trump's economy, which is to say that we can't judge Trump after COVID. And he admits that this is a fair defense, but then wants to apply that to the entire presidency of Joe Biden because everything that Joe Biden did was after COVID or the advent of COVID. Even if I was going to agree that COVID was a defense for a president's economic policy, which I don't. There's an obvious and clear distinction between a few months of general widespread panic and being 3 or 4 years removed from an epidemic. It'd be like saying that nobody can really judge a president's administration because, the economy was so different than before the housing crash. It'd be like saying Obama's economic policy is not up for analysis because his entire presidency came after the housing crash. Well, that's just baloney. We don't judge economic policy purely on the basis of its consequences. Obviously, that is a huge deal, but there's sophisticated analysis that goes on here, and I think it is very disingenuous for Destiny to suggest that there's no distinction between Trump's time in office under COVID and Joe Biden's time in office post-COVID. But at any rate, I don't agree with the defense of Trump that his economic policy could not be analyzed rationally and reasonably despite COVID. COVID is not some completely unanalyzable enigma to economists. Trump's policy and Joe Biden's policy are virtually identical with respect to how they treated COVID, so I don't even know why he brings this up. There's really no difference in terms of their economic policy under COVID. They both increased massive spending. Trump shut the economy down, and I think conservatives rightly criticize him for this. If there's one thing that his base seems to universally despise him for, it's his economic policies, his policy under COVID. He became something of a governmental authoritarian. It's not consistent with the conservative position, and I don't think anybody has to accept Destiny's strange notion that we can't judge either Joe Biden's presidency or Trump's after COVID. I think that that's baloney. Secondly, he then asks this rhetorical question, what did Trump do even before COVID? And he reduces Trump's economic policy to deficit spending, tax cuts, and historically low interest rates. Well, I think that that's obviously reductive, simplistically reductive. There is, again, enormous amounts of data out there in terms of what Trump did, both legislatively and in rolling back legislation. A point that I think Ben tries to bring up later on in the debate, but a lot of Trump's economic policy happens to be in removing regulation, in rolling back old regulations. And the data on the economy's performance compared to Obama's is quite clear. There is no doubt that Trump's economy was better than Obama's. Now, I think Destiny anticipates this objection and tries to explain the data by reference to, it's a liberal president and his economy begins to boom towards the end of his presidency, and then Republicans come in and they inherit this great economy, and then they wreck it, and then liberals come in and they have to inherit bad economies. Well, that's just an awful objection, obviously, again, because it's simplistic. It's overly reductive of how economies work. It completely ignores theoretical economic argumentation over the data on the economy. Again, I'm not going to get into all of this. If anybody's interested, please go to my newsletter. I've written on the Joe Biden economy over and over and over again. The whole narrative that Joe Biden's economy is booming and fantastic and much, much better than Trump's, and Trump's really wasn't that great to begin with, is malarkey. It's completely false. It's really not even defensible. Now, that's not to say that everything in Joe Biden's economy is falling. Like, I've written about that as well. Again, this was perhaps the least nuanced position of the entire debate for Destiny. I think it's perfectly acceptable to admit that these are gray areas, that the economy does not fit neatly into our polemical boxes. It's also not to say that everything that Trump did in the economy was great. I have tons of criticisms published on the Trump economy. Even Ben brings up that the biggest elephant in the room on Trump's economy was that he spent wildly more than Obama did. Republicans are horribly inconsistent. But if this were really a debate on conservatism versus liberalism, that wouldn't be much of an issue, I think, for conservatives. So I'm not going to do much more on that. All I'll say to wrap up in terms of the economy is that Trump's economic policy cannot simply be reduced to deficit spending and tax cuts and historically low interest rates, which he inherited from Obama, which is all false anyways. But even if it could be reduced to those things are not just like economically effete policies. Those are incredibly profound policies, besides deficit spending, which every president does anyway. So I don't know why he tries to reduce Trump's economic policy to deficit spending. There's never been a president since 1997 that hasn't done deficit spending. So, but at any rate, there's again a world of literature out there. Anybody who's genuinely curious on Trump's economic policies, a lot of which simply involved removing obstacles for entrepreneurship and creating incentives. Laffer wrote a whole book on it. He was the same economic advisor under Reagan's presidency, the only other period that meant a massive amount of growth. He completely ignores here, for example, Destiny, completely ignores here the stark difference between Trump's GDP growth per year and the historical average of all presidents. He was running 5 to 6% annual GDP growth, and now under Joe Biden, we're struggling to get above 2%. And every now and then we hear, from this year to last year's month, we have 3% growth, which is a misleading statistic to begin with because we're coming back from huge deceleration, a collapse of the economy, which, again, you don't necessarily have to lay at the feet of Joe Biden. That's not my point here. But this characterization of Joe Biden and Donald Trump's economy is just infantile, and Ben doesn't even remotely push back on it. He doesn't even remotely battle Destiny's highly contentious claims and overly reductive characterization of the economies. Moving on to the foreign policy issue, this is where I think things get really, really bad for Destiny, and where probably Ben does the best overall because it eventually merges into a conversation about the Israel-Palestine debate, and Ben is just clearly going to come off as more informed on that position. And because Destiny ultimately holds a very similar, if not almost identical position to him. But before we get there, I want to address a clip by Destiny on the Doha Agreement and Joe Biden versus Donald Trump on foreign policy. So here it is.
On the foreign policy, I'm going to be honest. I am very liberal. I'm very not progressive. I'll probably come off as more hawkish than others because I'm not a big fan of this. Which also, if Ben agrees, I think people like Trump are going to be the most dovish isolationist people ever. They don't want to do anything internationally. They just want to, protect America, be at home, protect our economy, don't do anything internationally, which is why he was constantly undermining NATO and constantly, attacking all of the European Union and, cheering on the UK for Brexiting away from the EU. I think that being said, I think that Biden has done a phenomenal job when it comes to foreign policy. I think that the coalition building was so important for Ukraine, Russia, and I'm so happy that he decided to go to our European allies and our NATO allies and try to build a coalition of people to help Ukraine so that wasn't only the United States. Personally, especially after doing a whole bunch of research, I do tend to side with Israel over Palestine in a lot of the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. I'm glad that Biden, while remaining a staunch defender of Israel, is trying to rein in some of the more aggressive posturing towards the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. I'm proud that Biden said, hey, listen, we're going to delay some of these attacks. Hey, listen, we are going to allow humanitarian aid here. Hey, listen, we are going to try to, not kill as many Palestinian people down there, while still, signaling that he would be a staunch supporter of Israel in the conflict, assuming the civilian casualties don't go too high. For foreign policy, blemishes. The biggest one you can give to Biden is Afghanistan and the pullout there. But man, are we going to talk about, the Inspector General report that says that one of the biggest reasons why the Afghanistan pullout was so disastrous was because of the Doha Accords, where Donald Trump headed talks that didn't even include the Afghanistan army. These were disasters. Like when Biden took office, we had 2,500 troops left in Afghanistan. What was the options even afforded to Biden at that point?
I want to start right there at the end with that last statement about the Doha Accords. Destiny has absolutely no idea what he's talking about, clearly, in this clip. I'm actually shocked that he would bring up, like, this as a defense for the Joe Biden administration's pulling out of Afghanistan. He mentions the Doha Accords as if this is something that the Republicans always avoid. Okay, first of all, the Doha Accords were not fulfilled by Trump. He did not actually finish the Doha Accords. Secondly, Biden had ample time in his presidency to withdraw from the Doha Accords, and he was advised to do so by all the same people that Trump was advised not to follow through with the Doha Accords, and Trump listened, and Joe Biden didn't. I can't even believe that Destiny is bringing up the Doha Accords as a defense for Joe Biden when it's precisely the opposite situation. Trump was the one who ended up listening to the advice of his military advisors not to go through the Doha Accords towards the end of his presidency. Even though he really wanted to, he ended up pulling back, and he didn't withdraw from Afghanistan, which was a directive of his administration towards the end of his presidency. And when Joe Biden got into office, the exact same advice was given to him by many of the same advisors and some of his own staff, and he rejected it, and he followed through with the Doha Accords. This is just a complete red herring from Destiny. Now, I will say, to be fair to Destiny, I think it's one of the only red herrings he really offers in the debate, whereas I think Ben frequently engaged in the red herring fallacy throughout this debate, never really responding to many of Destiny's arguments. But and also, to be fair to Destiny, this is a complex issue, I guess, mostly because liberals don't talk about it, mostly because information on the whole Afghanistan catastrophe is blacklisted. It's suppressed. It's not something which is disseminated widely unless you're in a conservative socioeconomic group. So here I'm just gonna again reference another book. This is the definitive book on the Afghan withdrawal. It is written by a army captain who was there on the ground, one of the 2,500 to 3,500 troops in Afghanistan when Joe Biden decided to withdraw. It's written by him and an investigative journalist. It is a fantastic book. It is very easy to read. It is extremely thorough and well documented. And nothing that Destiny said with respect to Afghanistan in this debate was remotely accurate. And in fact, his defense of Joe Biden's withdrawal of Afghanistan seems to be laid at the feet of the Doha Accords, which a lot of liberals appeal to, and it's simply not an effective defense. He had ample opportunity to avoid the Doha Accords. There was nothing tying him to the Doha Accords, and instead, he, first of all, didn't fire the guy who is a liberal, by the way, that Trump appointed as the head of the Doha Agreement and pushed forward with it. And he was advised not to do it in the same way Trump did, or in the same way Trump was, and Trump did not withdraw from Afghanistan on the basis of that advice, whereas Joe Biden did, and it was a complete catastrophe. Whitewashing the Afghanistan debacle is, quite frankly, just a disgrace. I mean, we should be recognizing Afghanistan for what it is. Let's call a spade a spade. Joe Biden made Afghanistan a political mission of his. He wanted nothing else. He didn't care how many people died. He simply wanted to get out of Afghanistan for a political stunt. And to be fair, I think Trump almost did the exact same thing. Again, it's not even a conservative liberal argument here. It's just a let's be truthful about the actual situation, the facts. I don't think Afghanistan is much of, if at all, a bonus point for Trump. But if you're going to try to make this Doha Accords defense, I think it ends up flipping back on you. Other things that he said in this speech, his diatribe here about foreign policy, a lot of it I would agree with. Again, having just been rather critical of Destiny's position on Afghanistan, I think he does a very good job of at least trying to defend Joe Biden on foreign policy. I think a lot of what he says is essentially accurate, at least with respect to how Joe Biden has responded to a lot of the crises. I would agree, in hindsight, in just an abstract conservative philosophical sense, Joe Biden's foreign policy has not been very objectionable because consistent with classical conservatism is the kind of hawkish foreign policy that both Destiny and Ben Shapiro, more or less to varying degrees, accept. Joe Biden was very clear and upfront when Russia invaded Ukraine that he was not going to involve foot soldiers any more than was already allowable or was already present in the region. I think there was like a couple hundred American soldiers that were ever involved in any way, shape, or form, and not in open combat in the Ukraine conflict, to my knowledge. So yeah, I would agree with Destiny about Joe Biden's position on the Russian-Ukraine thing. It comes up later in the debate, but he basically points out that Joe Biden's response was very responsible and non-antagonistic, and that his strategy in the Russian-Ukraine debate was more or less acceptable. Now, Ben and him have debates about that, and I think Ben makes some very good points about just the general lack of mission and throwing, huge amounts of money at Ukraine without there being sort of any kind of notion of an end date or et cetera. And Destiny, I think, rightly accepts those criticisms, or at least concedes them. But on the whole, Joe Biden's foreign policy was not really objectionable and has worked out well for America. We have greatly depleted our greatest military antagonist in the world through a proxy war in Ukraine. And I think Destiny's more or less correct about that. And again, I don't know if there's much, at least I don't know if there's much to object so far on Joe Biden's interaction with Israel over the Israel-Gaza conflict. I think the only things that I would have brought up that Ben did not bring up in the debate with Destiny is, here's an idea. Let's stop funding regions like Iran. Let's stop funding organizations like Hezbollah. And actually, Ben did bring that up in the debate about funding Iran. But let's stop funding Hezbollah. Let's stop funding Hamas. Let's stop funding terror organizations that are against U.S. allies. I think that would have been the only pushback I really would have given him on that. And it's the only criticism I have of the current administration. Rather than moving two U.S. aircraft carriers into the region and pretending like Yemen hasn't declared war on the United States, let's just stop funding them. Let's save some money by not continuing to spend uproariously on these people. The only other thing I think I would say about all of that, which the only sort of mischaracterization I think he gives, well, not the only one, I would say that his caricature of Trump's foreign policy position is exactly that, a caricature. I don't think it's fair to simply reduce, although I think in large part lots of people would agree with him, to simply reduce Trump's foreign policy to isolationism. There's not a lot in Trump's presidency that I would have identified as isolationist. Maybe it's a fair point. I mean, he certainly desired to get out of a lot of countries, but I think that that's consistent with the American public. And in that sense, then Joe Biden would be an isolationist because Joe Biden withdrew from Afghanistan. On the other hand, Trump did a great job fighting ISIS. He actually completely eliminated them. That wasn't really isolationist. And Ben brings this up in the debate, I think, to good effect. He does do a better job than Destiny on the ISIS issue. Destiny tries to, again, sort of whitewash the Obama administration and their horrible handling of the rise of ISIS. It was absolutely, I actually have spoken to generals at the Pentagon on the difference in terms of policy between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. They absolutely lay at the feet of Trump's policy decisions the annihilation of ISIS. It was the shift that he made in engagement policy, allowing American troops to simply go in and wipe everybody out involved in ISIS, that basically destroyed ISIS. And there were essentially handcuffs in the Obama administration that prevented the American military from appropriately fighting ISIS. So it's a caricature, it's a false caricature to simply describe Trump as an isolationist. And at any rate, who is out there defending that Trump is an ideal conservative? Trump is not a conservative. He's a Republican. And even then, he's almost not a Republican. If this is a debate, as it's framed to be, a debate between conservatism and liberalism, this is just not an issue. I don't know of any serious conservative intellectual out there that would make the case that Trump is a great conservative. I think they would make the case, as I think Ben tries to make the case in this debate, that he is a better option than Joe Biden because he's at least a closer approximation of conservatism, but he's still way off the mark. And I think most true classical conservatives, probably like Destiny, would pick more ideal candidates. Like, I'm sure if Destiny had his pick of political candidates, he probably wouldn't go with Joe Biden. He'd probably pick somebody he felt was a more nuanced, sophisticated, and honest liberal. Great. So, just like I wouldn't characterize AOC as a traditional liberal, why would we ever pretend like Donald Trump is representative of the conservative cause? I don't think he is, and I don't think most conservatives are isolationist. So I think that's just a fake caricature. Okay, so with that, we're now just past the 1 hour mark. So I think I'll leave it there for today. That's basically more or less my analysis of the debate. Like I said, I didn't get to every moment. I didn't spend so much time on Ben. My final concluding thoughts on the debate would be this. I didn't think Ben performed too well. I think he performed better in the latter half of the debate. But overall, I think Destiny came across much stronger. I think, especially to the more independent onlookers to this debate, I think Destiny will seem to have come out on top in this debate. I think Ben did a really poor job listening to the actual arguments that Destiny was offering. I think he did a very poor job generally just following the argument or the logic of the argument. He frequently offered red herrings or mischaracterizations of, essentially straw men, mischaracterizations of Destiny's arguments. And then in his responses, he was rarely succinct, often pontificating over and over again and getting into tangents. And I just don't think his performance was very great. Now, granted, to be fair to Ben, I don't think he saw this as a debate. I think he probably saw this more as like a casual discussion. And I think he did a great job, often keeping the conversation more or less civil. I think if anybody made it uncivil, it was probably Ben. But I think I would commend both of these guys for having a relatively non-hostile conversation on a lot of issues they disagree on. And I think they found a lot of agreement. I'm just disappointed. I think the lack of structure would have drawn out how much mutual agreement there really was. And if it was really about something like conservatism and liberalism, I think we would have seen that a lot of Destiny's objections just really don't fall towards classical conservatism, certainly, and even in instantiations of American conservatism. And I think Ben probably would have done a better job of actually addressing Destiny's arguments. So all that being said, it's a great clip. I commend both of these guys for their careers and their intellects. They're obviously movers and shakers in this field, and it's always a fascinating thing to get to see two leading thinkers in their respective movements like this interact. So hopefully you enjoyed my little debate analysis on issues like education and foreign policy and economics. And if you did, please like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. That's it for today. I am Eric Yanis signing off for episode 50 of the Eric Yanis Show. As always, thank you all so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.